Lecture will continue our discussion of KDE plots. We finished our last lecture by discussing how we can adjust the bandwidth of our univariate KDE plots by passing the bandwidth attribute. And another thing we can do is make the KDE plot appear on the y-axis instead of on the x-axis. For that, all we have to do is pass an attribute called vertical and set it to be equal to true. Let's see an example of that. So we can say SNS.KDE plot and then pass, let's say, y-axis. So this is the normal KDE plot. You see here the plot appears on the x-axis. So to make it appear on the y-axis, we pass another attribute called vertical. So SNS.KDE plot, and then we pass our y-axis attribute, y-axis, and then our vertical attribute and set it to be true. And if you run it, now the plot appears on the y-axis. And we can do the same for the x-axis variable. One last thing I want to show you is how we can plot more than one bivariate KDE plot on the same graph. So here, this is a KDE plot for a bivariate dataset. And we can also plot two of these KDE plots on the same graph. For that, we'll be using the iris dataset. And what we will do is take two of the iris species and consider two of the attributes, for instance, petal length and petal width for each of the two iris species, and then we'll plot two KDE plots to represent the two iris species. Okay, let's do that. Let's start by loading our iris dataset, and we'll save it in a variable called iris. SNS.load dataset, and then we'll pass our iris data. Once we load that, we'll be, as I mentioned, we'll be using two of the iris species. Let's use maybe Setosa and versicolor or virginica, it doesn't matter. Okay, let's start by Setosa. And for that, we'll pass so from the iris dataset, we'll set the species to be equal to Setosa. Okay, let's start by doing that. So Setosa. And once we have this, we'll be using the lock method and then save this in a variable called Setosa. So we'll use the iris.lock method on our iris species Setosa. And we'll do the same thing for our second iris species. Let's use versicolor. So we'll save that in a variable called versicolor. And we'll set that to be equal to iris.lock. And then we'll set the iris species to be versicolor. So iris.species, we'll set that to be equal to versicolor. Versicolor. Once we have our iris species, we can simply call these variables and pass the variable attributes that we want to calculate. In this case, maybe petal length and petal width. Okay, let's use that. So SNS.KDE plot, and we'll pass. So from Setosa, we want to use petal length and petal width. So what we can say is Setosa that we can call those attributes. One is petal length, and then the second one is what? Petal width. So for the same Setosa species. So Setosa that petal width. So that's for the Setosa iris species. And let's do the same. So this is the same as what we did before, x-axis and y-axis, right? Let's do the same for the second iris species, which is versicolor. So sns.kde plot, and then pass versicolor dot petal length, and then versicolor dot petal width. Make sure that you have both of the KDE plot methods in the same cell, otherwise you'll have two separate KDE plots. Okay, if we run this now, we have two KDE plots, right? They both look the same. What we can do is we can pass the color map attribute and then pass different color maps. So let me copy this, paste it here, and for our Setosa species, let's pass a color map of maybe cool one. We saw this earlier. And for our second KDE plot, we can leave the default, we can use the default color, or we can pass the color map attribute and pass another color, maybe RDBU. Let's see RDBU and run it. So now we have two different KDE plots with different color maps. We have on the x-axis we have petal length, on the y-axis petal width. And if you don't know which one is KDE, which one is Setosa and which one is versicolor, if you cannot tell from this color maps, we know that this color map RDBU is versicolor, so this is versicolor. But if you still want to be sure, you can pass, let's pass the shade parameter. So if we pass the shade parameter and then set it to be true, you'll see that it will be shaded, right? So now we know that this is versicolor and the other one is Setosa. I'll just remove the shade attribute and leave it like that. So this, in this KDE plots, note that we have petal length on the x-axis and petal width on the y-axis. We can change this also. Let's change the position of those so that petal width is on the x-axis and petal length is on the y-axis. Let's do that. So what we'll do is let's pass Setosa that petal width, so that will be on the x-axis, and petal length will be on the y-axis. And same thing here, petal width and petal length. Let's change their color. Let's use BlueSD, and we'll leave the second color map to be RDBU. Let's run it now. Okay, see, now we have petal width on the x-axis and petal length on the y-axis. So that's how you can draw two KDE plots for bivariate or two variables. And again, you can also apply the other attributes that we have learned, for instance contour lines, or the contour lines, or the other attributes that we have seen in the previous lecture. Okay, for instance, we can make this n underscore levels to be equal to, let's say 15, and run it again. You'll see 15 contour lines here, and so on. So this is the example I have for you. So for you to exercise, you can use sepal length and sepal width. So try to draw two KDE plots in the same graph, and then use sepal length and sepal width, and use any of the two iris species and compare your result and try out the different attributes like shade, different color maps, or number of contour lines, and so on. Okay? The important thing to remember is that you need to have both of your KDE plot methods in the same cell. Otherwise, you'll get two separate KDE plots. So for instance, if I run this in one cell and then run the first line in a separate cell, I will get two separate KDE plots. Let me show you. So RDBU, if I run the first cell, so I get a KDE plot for our versicolor species, and if I run the second cell, I get a KDE plot for our Setosa species. Great. That's all I have for the lecture on KDE.